First, I have to say I don't know a lot about Redis. I know this is a Redis conference. That probably seems odd, but I submitted the session and they accepted it. I do know a lot about Microsoft, and I tried to put Microsoft ASP.NET all over my proposal. I'm going to essentially treat Redis as a dictionary of keys and values, and I'm just going to expect it to work. And however many times it gets replicated, and I've gone to some sessions this morning, and I guess that's very important. And how it scales, I watched the last session, that was very important. 900,000 records a second, oh my God, does it really go that fast? That's incredible. I sort of think in terms of like 20, 30,000 is fast, so I'm very amazed at that. So we're going to be building a .NET app in Visual Studio from scratch. I'm hoping you guys, how many people know C# or at least can recognize C# when they see it? Okay, so you guys all need to tell the other people next to you when I show something, they say, oh yeah, that's a variable, that's a variable. So I'm going to kind of expect you to know it. The first 10 minutes is going to be slideware. I'm just going to be talking about stuff, and then the rest of it, we're going to be building the ASP.NET app. The app we're going to build is first using just standard internal memory cache, and we're going to build that in a pattern that we can then plug in a Redis provider and do the Redis. We're also going to install a Redis server along the way that runs under Windows. And of course, we're going to monitor it just so you know it's actually working. So I feel kind of silly even presenting what does Redis do for us. So I'm just going to tell you it's a key value pair, and that's really all it's going to do for us here. We're not even really going to talk about cache and validation. We're just going to be talking about cache from a read-only perspective. One thing I do absolutely know is that ASP.NET apps fall flat on their face if they don't have a lot of cache. If they don't have a really good caching strategy, you can easily turn a humongous Windows server into a server that can only serve like 5 people if you don't use cache in general. So it's critical. I'm really glad Redis is here. So I've talked a little about what we're going to cover today. Let me just review that real quickly. I'm going to talk about Microsoft and its history with Redis. More specifically, I'm going to talk about its history with open source. I don't know how much you guys know about Microsoft besides, Microsoft was once evil and they're now good. I guess you can write that down. MSOpenTech, we're going to talk some about that. That's Microsoft's initiative into the open space world. They kind of created an organization to support it, which is what big companies tend to do when they want to support something. Like I said, we're going to create a general caching solution for ASP.NET that works with internal cache, and then we're going to generalize that to make it work for Redis. We're going to actually just talk about page caching. We're not going to implement that because we'll be running out of time at that point. Page caching is essentially where you jump into the pipeline of the web server and cache the actual HTML that comes out at the very end of the processing. So you're literally doing what the browser cache is doing it, but you're doing it at a server level. And that, if you can do that, like if you have a page that really doesn't change very much, I mean, oh my God, you can like make your server incredibly performant because websites are phenomenal at basically processing static pages, which is essentially what you're doing. And then of course Redis stores that, which is very nice. And then session cache, again, I'll show you how to do it, but we won't demo it. Session cache is for things like shopping carts, where you're in a web form with hundreds of servers and someone keeps coming back and putting things in their cart, and you need to store that someplace. And typically people use a database for that, which is a very poor choice for scalability. Redis is really good at that kind of a thing. So we'll talk about that briefly. So before Redis, we just had a bunch of servers that, if you can read that, it says internal cache on each one of them. The downside of that, of course, is if, say, you have 100 servers in a web farm and you're trying to show today's weather on the screen, and every one of those servers has to go off to the weather server every 10 minutes and grab the weather, that's a problem. So the idea is that you add a Redis server to the mix, and then you hook that Redis server up in front of all your ASP.NET web servers, and they reach out to the Redis server to get the data. When the Redis server's data expires, then you basically go get the data, upload it to the Redis server, and then life continues. And the way I kind of said that on purpose in a way that there's some multi-threading issues there. And so we'll address those multi-threading issues because it's not the Redis server that's putting on the brakes and going and getting the data. It's whichever server happens to read the timeout first is going to actually do the work to repopulate Redis. And there's some scenarios that you'll see when everybody thinks that the cache is out and everyone goes and tries to get the data at the same time, and the system comes to a screeching halt for a second or two and then goes back to normal. We obviously want to avoid that. So let's talk a little bit about Microsoft and Redis. So you're probably thinking I'm going to want you to run Redis on Windows, and I'm really not. I don't really care. I think in terms of Redis as strictly a URL, a protocol, HTTP or HTTPS, and a port. It doesn't really matter where it runs. There is a Windows implementation, and I'm actually going to build that Windows implementation downloading from the MSOpenTech server and show you how to use that. It's extremely convenient for Windows developers like me because I don't have to launch a VM. I don't have to have anything separate set up. I can do it all in one place, and it's just extremely convenient. I think I won't say all, but I think most of the production Redis servers out there are Linux, so I think you'd have to think really hard if you were going to use MSOpenTech in production. I don't know good or bad, but I think personally I would feel more comfortable running a Linux VM and connecting that in production. Hopefully it runs the same as the Windows one. So back to Microsoft and Redis a little bit. Let me get... So back to Redis and Microsoft a little bit. So basically, Microsoft, we know, was evil and is not evil anymore. About 10 years ago, Microsoft started this transition from evil to not evil. The current executive vice president, who's in charge of Visual Studio and all things Azure, is a guy named Scott Guthrie. And Scott Guthrie is he's always been a big advocate of open source. And so as he's been at Microsoft year after year, he originally started ASP.NET when he was a 27-year-old back in 2001. Now he's really old at 41, and he's an executive vice president. But he really is the driving force, I believe, behind Microsoft really adopting open source. So let me talk about their OpenTech organization a little bit. It was created in 2012, so it hasn't been around for that long. Microsoft believes it's an open source enabler. They believe that by having this organization, they can encourage open source projects to come over and be part of the Microsoft ecosystem. They believe that's going to help adoption across all the platforms, not just Microsoft. And they believe that's good for them and that's good for Microsoft. And so again, I mentioned Scott Guthrie earlier as the major driving force. And at this point, he's, I believe, in the top 5 executives reporting to Satya at Microsoft. So I think that this will be a very good long-term solution for Microsoft, and it will continue to be heavily involved in open source. And for example, Azure now Redis is their only caching solution. They don't have any other caching solutions. They basically abandon all their other solutions that they had built themselves, and so Redis is basically it. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at the MSOpenTech GitHub website, and we're going to download from MSOpenTech Redis, and then we're going to briefly build it. So I have to apologize a little bit. I got a little carried away with my toys here. I have this monitor, which I was going to put all my notes on, and then I was going to magically cut and paste things into my MacBook running Parallels. Okay, too many toys. And then you weren't going to see me do cutting and pasting back and forth. But unfortunately, I should have done more testing, didn't do enough testing. So now we're going to go back to a non-mirrored mode. And now you're actually looking at my laptop running, hopefully, yeah, running, you're seeing exactly what I'm seeing. And so I've got Visual Studio running. What you're going to see is my notes window here. I actually have all these notes. A long time ago when I started doing presentations, I used to really prove how great a typer I was, and I would type the code directly, and a couple of my friends said, you don't really need to do that. We don't need to watch you type. So as I build my demos, I'm going to be cutting and pasting sections of code. So instead of the code magically appearing from some Visual Studio magic shortcut that I didn't create, I'm going to be jumping back and forth to this TextPad window. So if you could just blink at the appropriate times and miss it, then we'll all be good. So let me shrink this down a little bit. Oh, come on, shrink down. So like I said, we're going to go to the MSOpenTech project. Network. We don't have a network here. We have a guest network. Okay, well, I actually have, all I really needed the network for was to show you that slide. And you guys all saw that slide, right? So you see that's the download. Imagine that I downloaded it. Now I actually have it. What do you know? Okay, so here it is. Whew, I don't know how it got here, but it's right here. So I'm going to unzip this download. Look, it's already unzipped. No, I'm going to unzip it someplace. And I'm going to extract it to C temp here. So we're going to spend all of like 2.5 minutes building it because I think it's important to see it. So basically, here's Redis, and this looks very much like a tarball kind of install. I mean, it's funny, you're downloading what you think is the Windows version, and it comes down and looks like a tarball. But in this tarball-looking directory, there's this MSVS, which I'm not surprised they didn't use all 8 characters to describe it. So Redis Server, essentially, is the Visual Studio solution project. So if I go into Visual Studio, and I open that, open project, I'm in that directory. Hopefully you all recognize Visual Studio. It's going to pull that in. It's actually 9 projects. One of the things that I really like, it says upgrade to Visual Studio C++. And the first time I saw that, I thought that, well, that's not going to work. But surprisingly, I can rebuild everything, and it builds perfectly. So, I'm essentially in 20 seconds going to rebuild all of the Windows Redis. And if I go into this directory underneath MSVS, you can kind of see it building in the background called x64 debug. This essentially is, see, it's done now. Well, it's almost done. Done. Come on. Hurry. This essentially is our Redis projects. And in this directory, you'll see I have, rebuild all 9 successful. I don't know the alphabet backwards, so I have to sort forwards. So there's only two things we're going to do here today. We're going to use Redis server.exe, and we're going to use Redis CLI.exe. So I first run Redis server. It asks me to allow access because it's opening up a port, and I think it's going to allow me to get to it externally, which I don't care about. So this is Redis server running in standalone mode. It's showing that it's running on port 6379, which is good. So we have our URL, localhost in port 6379. That's really all we need to do development for what we're doing with Redis. And then I'm going to open up a DOS prompt in the same directory, and I'm going to run the CLI, Redis-CLI monitor. And it says, OK. So now basically it's just listening. Redis is running, and I have the monitor listening. And the reason that I did that is as we build the Visual Studio project, I need to prove to you that I'm actually caching with Redis. And so we'll see the details as it goes by, and we'll see when it caches and when it doesn't. So we're going to abandon that for a little while. And let's go into Visual Studio. This is where you need to, guys, everybody close their eyes for a second to remind myself what I do next. So let me grab this into my paste buffer. You're not supposed to be seeing this. OK, so I'm going to go back into Visual Studio, and let's now create a Visual Studio website. And I do that by saying create a new project. And I've been doing ASP.NET for 10 years, so I sort of feel like I know all the things that make it seem like it's really easy to do. But I'm going to say C# web ASP.NET web app, and I'm going to call it web app, and I'll call it CL for class or something. And I'm going to basically say OK. And so this is where Microsoft is trying to straighten this out in the next generation of ASP.NET, which they're calling ASP.NET Core. These choices have gotten totally out of control. Nobody knows where to go when you get this menu up. So for example, ASP.NET has web forms, which they created 12 years ago. They have MVC, which they created 7 years ago. They have Web API, which they created 5 years ago. They have mobile. I mean, and then it's like you can say, I want web forms with MVC and Web API. Well, okay, no, I want MVC with web forms. And what's really annoying is those aren't all the same things. And so I've learned if I want to create a website, I say MVC, and then I can add the other things and that works. But if I say create web forms and then add MVC, it actually doesn't work. So if you want to do this at home, make sure you choose MVC, and then whatever you want is going to work. I don't want any authentication that's login stuff because we're not going to show that. I'm not going to host it in the cloud. Microsoft's now all about the cloud, so you can't help but be asked, do you want to deploy this to Azure like every step of the way? So we're essentially now creating an empty Visual Studio, not an empty Visual Studio, but a default Visual Studio website. So if I run that, I'm going to get, you guys will tell me if it disappears, right? You won't all just sit there looking at me like I know what I'm talking about. So when I run that, basically, it's going to give me the default page for a Visual Studio website project. That's it. Nothing special. It's got home, it's got about, it's got contact. So let's go back and look at what we actually have here. What Microsoft scaffolded for us is they scaffolded in this controllers directory a home controller. And the home controller essentially has endpoints for each of the pages: index, about, and contact. So that's how come we could go to all 3 pages. And then it has a views directory. This is a classic models view controller architecture. And underneath home, we have about, we have contact, and we have index. And Visual Studio is now adding toolbar items for us. Thank you for being so considerate. So when that's done, we're going to go back to the controllers directory, and we're going to scaffold a new test controller where we're going to demonstrate creating cache. So I do that by saying add controller, and I'm going to ask for an MVC5 empty controller. Again, this is where Microsoft's kind of gone off the deep end. I don't know how anyone knows what choices to pick. So I'm going to call it a test controller, and by default, it's going to come up empty with basically just an index class. And if I look down here, it created a test directory underneath my views, but there's actually no like index CSHTML there. CSHTML is the extension for a Razor file. That's really kind of like a PHP template. It's just a template that gets processed by the controller, and HTML gets spit out by what's called the Razor view engine. So if I go back to my test controller, and if you remember a moment ago, I put a bunch of stuff in my paste buffer. Right now, it's just returning the view, which has nothing to do. So I'm going to cut that, and I'm going to paste in some magic code, including some timer stuff. So I wrote this method called getSomeRealData. GetSomeRealData essentially just creates a string of some arbitrary length. I'm calling it 10 megabytes. And it randomizes the alphabet and some numbers and stuffs that into a 10 megabyte string. And I did that because I really want this to take some time. I don't want it to say, oh, it ran in 0. Everything I'm doing is 0. How can you tell anything is working? So I basically have a controller now that starts a timer, generates this test 10 megabytes of data, and then stops the timer. Then I essentially want to take the results of what it did. I want to take the length of the string it created, just so I have some sanity to know it really worked, what the time is now, and how many milliseconds it took to actually do that. And I'm going to return it through the view as model data. So this is the object initializer syntax to basically create what I'm calling model data. One of the nice things with Visual Studio and some add-ons is you can essentially just say create Razor view index, and it automatically builds the index for me, which is just very convenient. And it passes in the type of that model, so I can literally substitute variables. So if you guys all just blink for a second, I go here and I grab some data. And so in my div tags, on this, what I'm calling a Razor page, which is a page that gets generated from my model, I'm going to output the data that was generated in the view, which is the time right now, how long it actually took to get the data, and the length. So when I run this project, but before I run it, because I'm going to be running this a lot, I'm going to make the default page test. So I can tell Visual Studio to always start at the localhost /port/test. Let's go back here. Save that. So now when I run this, it's going to direct to my new test controller. It's going to pump that data that I generated through the view page, and it's going to show that at 3:36 and 43 seconds, it took 391 milliseconds to generate that 10 megabytes of data. And if I refresh this, it changes to 385 milliseconds, 383. I mean, you can kind of see it's going to be based on what my computer's doing, but roughly 3/10 of a second to generate that data. So you kind of probably know why I did that. My plan basically is I want to cache that data, and then the next time the request comes by, if that data is cached, I want to pull it out of the cache. So let's go back to the test controller, and let's focus on really just this one line here. So guys are blinking again. I'm going to create a very simple ASP.NET cache, which is part of the ASP.NET model, basically just baked into ASP.NET. As Microsoft likes to bake things in, they of course bake cache directly into the ASP.NET kind of framework. So what we're doing here is we're asking the built-in cache, which we reference by saying system.web HTTP context current cache. We reference it with a key, and if it returns anything but null, then we got our data, because that's all this particular dictionary knows how to return. If it returns null, that means we haven't loaded it yet. So then we essentially call get some real data, and then we turn around and stuff that into the cache and tell it to persist for 10 seconds and then expire at the end of 10 seconds. And then we stop our timer. So now when we run this, and I mean, just so you kind of keep in the back of your mind, you didn't see any locking in there, so that's actually bad. Now when I run this the first time, it took 393 milliseconds. When I run it again, it essentially took 0, because I mean, it's just reading it out of a local memory array, and that's like way less than a millisecond. So it's going to show 0. Until after 10 seconds, it's going to come back and show 385 again, 0, 0, 0. So you kind of get the idea, right? I mean, this is a very standard cache pattern. So I'm going to take it one more step. I'm going to generalize that just a little bit, not a lot, and I'm going to add nice locking. See, my note says generalize cache a little. So I'm going to comment this out. Let's see, yeah, that was a method. So actually, that was a method. That wasn't like inline code. So I don't want to paste it right there. I actually want to paste it inside my class as another method. And notice now, I have this locker, which basically takes my multi-threaded ASP.NET application with all these threads running around and gives me a way to slam the brakes on before something happens. So if I look up the cache, which is what I do here, and it's not in cache, if it is in cache, it just returns everything's happy. But if it's not in cache, I essentially need to slam on the brakes, tell no other thread to come through, to just wait. I'm going to go get that data, and when I've got the data, then you can come in and get it. So I lock all the other threads on my web server stop. I call the cache, basically, get the cache. I actually have to check again because someone else may have beat me here, and so they may have actually gotten the data before I got to the data. And so I need to check again after my lock to make sure no one, the two people didn't arrive at the lock almost at the same time, and we both went after the data. So then I stop. If I make it through that, then I'm essentially going to execute this dynamic function. You guys probably didn't realize that C# is a functional language, but it actually is. I can pass a function into this get method, which I'm going to call in a second. I execute that function simply by saying func open paren, close paren. Gosh, it feels just like JavaScript. And then I insert it into the cache. And so, of course, I have to call it, right? Because I commented out all my code. I don't have any way to call it. So let me grab that. Put that in the same place I had before. And you can see now I'm actually passing the function, get some real data. So we're actually now just passing a function that will get executed to pull in the data. So this is pretty clean, right? I mean, that's about as clean as you get for calling something and not having to worry about doing all this crazy locking. And of course, when I run it, this is now, I had it set to 5 seconds, so the cache is going to expire a lot more quickly. Could someone slow that timer down? So now, basically the first time, here's 379 milliseconds, 0, 0, and after 5 seconds, it's going to do it again. So, we're continuing to work. We know what we're doing. So the next thing we want to do, and now we're getting towards Redis, is, let's see. Second. So the next thing we want to do is we want to basically bring in 4 files, and let me just bring those files in. It would take me probably 15 minutes to bring them in one at a time and explain them. So I'm just going to dump them right in and then just tell you what they all are, if I can find them. Speaker, where am I? Redis speaking, demo. I have some source here, cache. So I've got these 4 files, and I'm literally just going to drag and drop them into my Visual Studio project. And these files, if I look at tcache.cs, is essentially the same kind of file as we created, but it's generalized with, you can see it, instead of having to actually specify string and write a special string method, I'm doing it with a generic type, so I can have func of t, I can get any type I want, I can get a Boolean, I can get an integer, I can get a complex type that's serializable. So I can do a lot more now with this generalized class. And tcache internal essentially is exactly what we wrote before. It's got the same HTTP context cache insert. Everything's exactly what we looked at before, but instead of calling it str for string, I'm calling it obj for object. What's interesting now is I have tcache Redis. And notice that at the top of this file, I have a namespace declared using stackexchange.redis, and it's showing red because it can't find it. And I'm using this static declaration of an iDatabase, which is actually the Redis database. So I have to install some client software so that Redis can so that we can talk to Redis through C#. Microsoft through Visual Studio has a package manager called NuGet. I'm going to paste that line of, I'm not going to paste that line of code. I'm going to paste install package stackexchange.redis, which essentially is what NuGet's way of saying I want to install that package. And you notice as I'm installing this, it basically brought in the library from this project called stackexchange.redis. And notice that automatically this is now, the error is gone, and all my types are clean. So I can now compile this particular module, which is exactly the same as the one I built for ASP.NET internal, but this has all the Redis magic in it to serialize up the object, to do the string put, the string, not put and get, the equivalent of saving cache and reading cache. So you can see in this method that actually this method I wrote. I didn't write the library, but you can see I'm locking Redis so that I can update it, unlocking Redis. I'm serializing. I'm using Redis string get to actually get the data out of Redis. To put the data into Redis, I'm using string, I want to say string put, but I think that's wrong. String set, thank you, yes, yes. I've been doing a lot of REST stuff, so I've got like put, post, get, delete on my mind. So essentially now I have this tcache Redis file that I want to execute. So you're probably wondering to yourself, well, how is he going to make it call that one and not the other one? So if I look in this file called tcache, and I look at the very top, I have this parameter I created called Redis cache, and I'm reading this variable Redis cache, which is one of my settings for the website. And then if that's set to true, I'm going to instantiate the Redis cache. Otherwise, I'm going to instantiate the internal cache. And so that way, this is sort of a poor man's way of doing dependency injection, but everything is loaded at the same time. At runtime, you just point at which library you want to use. My really smart .NET friends, when I show them this, they mutter things like structure map, and why would anyone do anything like this? But it's much simpler to write and much easier to explain is my only excuse. So where do I store this information, these app settings? So every IIS website, every ASP.NET website has a web.config where we have these app settings. And so I'm going to add these app settings. God, slow that thing down. I'm going to add these app settings to my web.config. And so here we have Redis set to true. I've defined my Redis cache server as localhost. And remember I said earlier, to me, Redis is just a URL and a port. So one thing I'm going to mention, how I ended up here, just a short interlude, is I did a 6-hour course on building multi-tenant ASP.NET net apps on a video site called Pluralsight. And I did like 15 minutes on integrating Redis, so I wrote all this code. And Dave Nielsen posted on Twitter closing submissions for sessions. And I said, I could do a Redis session with ASP.NET. And he said yes, and before I know it, I was signed up. So anyway, so this is basically this is the example out of that course. And so when I post this back in, and because this is set to true, when I run the site now, oh, you know what? It's not going to work because I haven't put the call into my controller. So let's go do that. See, every time I go off script, bad things happen. Need to learn not to do that. So if I go back to where did I put the call? There it is. Thank you. Yeah. So this essentially is the worker. This is in the test controller. So now I'm going to comment out my last example, which got even simpler, is just one line. And remember, I called this function. I actually passed in a function that was declared below. Well, now I'm going to use a lambda expression to create that function. In C#, this open paren close % equals greater than is a lambda expression that says execute the code in the curly brackets, and whatever that returns, pass that back. So this essentially is exactly the same as creating that function below and then returning the data. So it's convenient because now when I want to create something in cache, I can just write the code in line without having to create a method, call the method, get the method back. I can do it all in line. And notice I've changed the length to 2048 from 10 million. The reason I did that is I'm not smart enough to know how to get Monitor not to spit that out. And so the first time I ran it with 10 million, Monitor just ran forever, logging all the CL Monitor. So I changed this to 2K, but luckily it's still got enough work that it's going to show us, the connecting back and forth to Redis is enough that it does take some time. So now when I run this, and I'm going to run that, and I'm going to bring up my Redis Monitor while I'm running it. And you can see if we did it right, which we obviously did because the CLI Monitor jumped into action. You can see that random string here getting processed. And if I refresh, let me shrink this browser a little bit. If I refresh, it's going to get it again because I was too slow. But if I refresh quickly, you notice that all I'm doing is I'm calling the cache, and it's fulfilling it with cache, right? There was no loading that big string and setting it. It was essentially just getting it out of cache. So that's kind of the crux. That's really what I wanted to get across, is in ASP.NET, it's very easy to use Redis as a read-only cache. And there's so much more to Redis that you could integrate into ASP.NET, and these libraries do a lot more. Let me switch. Should I switch back to my slideware? Yeah, let me switch back to my slideware and just kind of talk about two other projects, because I want to end in 4 minutes and do 5 minutes of questions. So if I go back to mirroring, no, I want mirror displays. So I'm now back in PowerPoint, theoretically. No, that's not good. So if I run slideshow from current slide, good, okay, so you can see that. So I installed from Redis, I downloaded, I showed the Redis files. You can also install Redis as a service. There's a doc for that in the Redis install directory. Here's Redis server running and the log running. We did the demonstrations. The Stack Exchange. There's really not much to show here. So there's two projects that are out there, and I'll have those in the PowerPoint slides that take this one step further. One is it's actually in the very beginning. One is let me go zooming back to my introduction. Come on. Yeah, one is the page cache. So there's a Redis project that lets you actually store the HTML that's generated in Redis. So all you literally have to do is put an attribute on the controller to tell it use Redis cache, and then you put in your web config a little configuration block that tells where the Redis server is. And the other is session cache, which is exactly the same. In the web config, you say if you're going to use session, which is a feature built into ASP.NET that's very easy to use, and it will automatically, so if you don't say anything, it will use the memory of the local server and assume you have only one server. If you specify a database, that's what most people do, it'll use the database to maintain session data. And of course, if you use Redis, now you're using Redis. And the session server knows how to track which web server you're on and keep track of when you come back, it knows that, okay, you're this particular user that came into the same browser session. So essentially, those are the other two things that you can do with Redis that are just very easy out of the box using ASP.NET. So then I guess finally, we're getting to questions now. After all this, if you want to know who I am, I decided I'd put my bio at the end, if anyone's still here. Otherwise, they won't know who I am. Who is that guy? So I've been a Microsoft MVP for 10 years. I write video courses. Silicon Valley Code Camp. Anybody know Silicon Valley Code Camp? So I organized that for 11 years. I did Angular U last year, and I went to college. So that's basically it for my session. I'm 1 minute and 22 seconds early for Q&A. This is great. As I said, I don't really know anything about Redis besides my little trick to get the data in. I'm happy to answer anything that's Microsoft, ASP.NET, IIS related, but we brought an expert who will introduce himself in a second. And if it's Redis related, I'm going to say and. So questions?
Thank you. If we don't have time, maybe after the session ends, if you could go back to actually put the full 10,000 byte string, when you reduced it to 2048, it did kind of change the time. I'm wondering if there is a big difference. So maybe after. If there's no,
yeah, essentially I have to stop the logging to do that. Yeah, happy to do it. Yeah. I'm hoping it's very fast.
Thanks. Hi, the Stack Exchange Redis package that you loaded, will that work on a Linux environment as well?
So
Linux implementation?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. The next version of Microsoft's ASP.NET is called ASP.NET Core. their version numbering is really screwy, so don't pay any attention to, they used to call it ASP.NET 6, they decided, well, that's so different, we need to call it ASP.NET 1, then we'll think we started again, they got all confused. So the next version is ASP.NET Core, and likely all these packages will get converted because .NET will run on Linux in the next major release. It's in like public preview 2 right now, so I think we're all expecting in a month or 2 it will release. So the answer is no, none of that will work in Linux right now. Yes, it will. Would I actually use it for a year? Probably not.
I'm not,
Did I not
who asked
answer?
the question?
Yes, running in Linux, right?
Did you mean will it run against the Redis server in a Linux box?
Yeah, so
Oh,
you
of
mentioned
course,
there's
of course.
Windows Redis and a Linux Redis. So
Yeah.
the Stack Exchange Redis package, will that connect to Linux Redis?
Absolutely, and even to the point that that's what Azure, right? I mean, you connect to Azure. I'm sure Azure is a Linux version
No.
of Redis. It's not.
It's not. They're
It's not-
using,
it's
they're
not-
dog fooding.
It's not MSOpenTech. I'm sure of that.
It is.
Is it?
Yeah.
Is it really? Okay, I stand
Yeah.
corrected. Use MSOpenTech. I personally, like, I have a WordPress blog, and I tried to run it on Windows, and it was a total disaster. It runs so well on PHP and Unix. More questions? Yeah. Oh, wait, microphone.
If I get hold of the source code of Redis for session, can it be used on the current ASP.NET API without upgrading?
Yes.
That's just yes.
Works.
Yeah. Everything I showed was the current ASP.NET production. It's been out there forever. Nothing, nothing's unstable. All just current. Yeah, I didn't do anything with ASP.NET Core future stuff. All that stuff is current.
Hi, I was unfamiliar with the Asp.NET caching infrastructure that they had in place. Does that support invalidation semantics like I know the Redis library must itself?
So it does. There's, kind of like all Microsoft libraries, it's got a parameter string that goes on forever when you do insert. And so one of the things you can pass is a dependency function. My feeling with the internal cache with ASP.NET is, so one thing, that cache is not open. So you can't, Microsoft, or .NET has this concept of a sealed class, and it infuriated all of us that they sealed cache. So you can't extend cache. So it doesn't do you any good outside of using their internal cache provider. You can write something similar, which is essentially what we did, but you can't use theirs. And everybody I know who uses internal cache has been bit badly by it. It really is not meant to be, it's running in the IIS page pool. It's just, it's toy stuff, small. Not, if you're thinking Redis because you want to scale, you shouldn't be thinking ASP.NET internal cache. So yes, but no, wouldn't use it.
The real thing, I think, the real difference between using internal cache and Redis, for example, is the fact that you can take Redis and install it on a different server than your application server, right? And there are a couple of big advantages when you do that, instead of using whatever internal caching mechanism, ASP or not. The first is you decouple the cache's resource from the application server, so you can keep your application servers very lean, and on the same day or at the other side of the house, scale your cache as much as you want. The other less obvious but perhaps more important advantage is the fact that if each and every application instance keeps its own cache, and let's say that you're caching perhaps a database or even web pages, then each application server will ultimately need to go and refresh its own cache, probably not really lowering the load on your SQL server or whatever. With a central cache, only one client, you lock it like you showed perhaps, or something similar, you put it in the cache and then everyone gains. Yeah. So that's a motivation when you want to move towards something like a shared cache like Redis.
Right. So does that mean that there's no real value in having that DI abstraction that you did other than sampling?
Well, development,
Yeah,
right?
sure. And
Yeah,
testing
I mean, it's
and-
great when you're doing development. So I have 0 seconds left. I want to thank you guys for all putting up with my swapping. Hope nobody got too dizzy from all that. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.